Lucas Anderson leaned back in his office chair, staring at the report in front of him. Sales were steady, but something felt off. Over the past few months, complaints about one of his fast food locations had been increasing. Orders were wrong, wait times were long, and worst of all, employee morale seemed to be at an all-time low. He had built this business from nothing, starting with a single small burger joint 10 years ago, growing it into a successful chain with 10 locations scattered across the state. He prided himself on treating his employees well, believing that happy workers led to happy customers. But something was clearly going wrong at this particular store. Lucas had tried addressing the concerns through his district manager, but the answers were vague. "It's just a tough area," he was told. "We have some lazy employees." But Lucas knew better than to take second-hand reports at face value. There was only one way to find out the truth. He needed to see it for himself. A week later, Lucas walked into the store as a new trainee. His disguise was simple but effective: dark brown hair dyed a dull black, thick-rimmed glasses, and a well-groomed beard. His usual confident posture was replaced with a slightly awkward stance, and he wore the standard uniform, a blue polo and black cap. Since this was one of the newer locations, most of the employees had never met him in person. He had always relied on his district manager to run things here, and now he was regretting that decision. The store manager, a tall, heavy-set man named Greg, barely gave him a glance when he walked in. "You're the new guy," Greg grumbled, looking at the schedule. "Great, we're short-staffed again, so don't slow us down." Lucas nodded, playing along. "Got it, just tell me what to do," Greg scoffed. "Yeah, sure, do yourself a favor and don't ask too many questions. And if customers get mad, just apologize and move on. This ain't rocket science." Lucas didn't like his tone, but he kept quiet. He needed to see how things really worked here before making any judgments. His first few hours on the job were rough. The kitchen was chaotic, with orders piling up and workers scrambling to keep up. The fry station was a mess, and the register kept freezing. One thing stood out immediately: there was one employee who seemed to be doing everything. A teenage boy, no older than 17, was running between the grill, the fryer, and the drive-thru. He was fast, efficient, and polite even when customers were rude. Lucas noticed the kid's name tag, Simon. He also noticed something else: Greg constantly belittled him. "Simon, are you deaf? I said get the fries out faster. God, you're useless. No wonder we're always behind. Maybe if you weren't so slow, customers wouldn't be complaining." Lucas clenched his jaw. Simon never talked back, never argued, just nodded and kept working. But Lucas saw the way the boy's shoulders tensed every time Greg barked at him. Lucas took a deep breath. He had to stay in character. He couldn't blow his cover just yet. But as the day went on, Greg's behavior only got worse, and Lucas was quickly reaching his breaking point. Lucas kept his head down, working through the evening rush while keeping an eye on everything happening around him. The kitchen was a disaster. Burnt fries were being served, burger patties sat under heat lamps for far too long, and half the time, the orders were wrong. The employees weren't lazy, they were overwhelmed. There weren't enough people scheduled, and the ones who were there moved with a frantic kind of exhaustion, like they'd already given up trying to keep up. The worst part was Greg. Lucas had already seen how he treated Simon, but as the night went on, it became clear it wasn't just him. A young woman named Maria, who was handling the register, hesitated when a customer asked about an item that wasn't ringing up correctly. Greg stormed over before she could even finish explaining the issue. "Do I have to do everything myself?" he snapped, shoving her aside to punch buttons on the screen. "It's not that hard. Use your brain." Maria stepped back, pressing her lips together. She didn't argue, just nodded and kept taking orders. Lucas could see the way her hands shook slightly as she handled the cash. She was scared of him. By now, Lucas had seen enough. The problem at this location wasn't bad employees or a tough customer base. It was Greg. He ran the store like a tyrant, barking orders, belittling his staff, and making an already stressful job unbearable. Lucas knew he couldn't blow his cover yet. He needed to see how far this went. At one point, while Lucas was refilling the napkin dispensers near the counter, Simon walked past him, heading toward the back. Greg's voice cut through the noise again. "Where do you think you're going?" Simon stopped in his tracks. "I just need to grab more buns. The grill's running low." Greg rolled his eyes. "Oh, sure. Take your sweet time while the rest of us actually work." Simon didn't respond, just turned and hurried toward the storage area. Lucas followed a few minutes later, pretending to grab paper bags from the shelves. Simon stood there for a moment, hands resting on the supply rack, taking slow, deep breaths like he was trying to keep himself together. "Rough shift?" Lucas asked casually. Simon gave a small, humorless laugh. "It's always like this." Lucas hesitated before pushing a little further. "Why not quit?" Simon shrugged. "I need the job. My mom works 2 jobs already and we're barely making rent. I can't just walk away." Lucas felt a pang of anger not at Simon, but at the situation. This kid was working himself to the bone to help his family, and Greg treated him like garbage. Before Lucas could say anything else, Greg's voice shouted from the front. "Simon, get back to work or don't bother coming in tomorrow." Simon sighed, grabbed the buns, and hurried back. Lucas followed, gripping the stack of paper bags a little tighter than necessary. As the shift dragged on, Lucas noticed something else. Greg wasn't just verbally abusive. He was cutting corners in ways that hurt both employees and customers. At one point, a customer returned a burger, complaining that it was cold. Instead of making a fresh one, Greg grabbed the same sandwich, threw it back on the grill for a few seconds, and sent it out again. Later, a delivery truck arrived with fresh ingredients. Greg barely glanced at the shipment before signing off on it, even though Lucas spotted several boxes that were dented or leaking. When one of the fryers started malfunctioning, spewing grease onto the floor, Greg ignored it. "Just throw some towels down," he muttered when Maria pointed it out. "We don't have time to fix it now." Lucas was reaching his limit. He had seen enough. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was outright neglect. The employees were miserable, the customers were getting subpar food, and Greg didn't care about anything except making his own job easier. By the time the shift ended, Lucas knew what he had to do. Tomorrow, he would come back, but not as a trainee. It was time for Greg to face the truth. Lucas arrived at the restaurant the next day, no longer in disguise. He stepped inside just as the lunch rush was picking up, scanning the room with fresh eyes. Customers waited impatiently for their orders, employees moved with practiced exhaustion, and Greg stood near the counter, barking orders as usual. Greg hadn't noticed him yet. Lucas took in the scene one last time, committing it to memory. The broken fryer still hadn't been fixed. The same dented supply boxes sat in the corner, untouched. Maria avoided eye contact with Greg, keeping her head down while ringing up customers. And Simon, already drenched in sweat, worked the grill with the same quiet determination. Lucas didn't waste any time. He walked straight to Greg, stopping just a few feet away. Greg barely glanced at him before snapping at Maria. "I don't care what they ordered, just get it out." Lucas cleared his throat. "Greg." Greg turned, ready to dismiss whoever was speaking. His expression shifted the moment he recognized Lucas. His mouth opened slightly, his posture stiffening. "Mr. Anderson," the room quieted slightly. Employees who had been too busy scrambling through orders now stole quick glances toward them. Lucas let the silence sit for a moment before speaking again, his voice even. "Let's talk, now." Greg hesitated but nodded, leading the way to the back office. Lucas followed, shutting the door behind them. Greg attempted a nervous chuckle. "Didn't expect to see you here. What brings you?" Lucas cut him off. "I've been here, Greg. I worked a full shift yesterday undercover." Greg blinked, his jaw tightening. "Undercover?" Lucas didn't let him recover. "I saw how you treat the employees, the way you talk to Simon, to Maria, to everyone. I watched you ignore safety issues, send out bad food, and refuse to fix broken equipment." He took a step closer, voice calm but firm. "So tell me, Greg, what exactly do you do here?" Greg's face flushed. Look, you berate your staff, you humiliate them in front of customers, you cut corners to make your job easier while the people under you pick up the slack. Lucas folded his arms. This isn't leadership, it's laziness. Greg scoffed, attempting to recover. They're kids, they need to toughen up. This is fast food, not daycare. Lucas' expression didn't change. Simon is 17, working harder than anyone here, and you treat him like garbage. Maria is trying to do her job while you undermine her at every step. You don't lead, Greg, you control. And that ends today. Greg's confidence wavered. Come on, I've been here for years. I know how to run this place better than anyone. Lucas nodded. That's the problem, you've been here too long and you've learned all the wrong lessons. He gestured toward the door. You're done. Get your things and leave. Greg's face darkened. You can't just, I can, and I just did. Lucas held his gaze. I trust my employees to handle the rest of the shift without you. Go. Greg stared at him for a long moment before exhaling sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. But he saw it in Lucas' expression, there was no room for argument. Without another word, Greg turned, yanked open the door, and stormed out. Lucas followed, watching as Greg grabbed his coat from the back room and shoved his way out of the restaurant. The door swung shut behind him, leaving the restaurant momentarily still. The employees were frozen, waiting for some kind of explanation. Lucas stepped forward, his voice carrying across the room. Greg is gone. Things change starting today. Simon looked up from the grill, stunned. Maria exchanged glances with another cashier. The tension in the room shifted, disbelief turning into something almost resembling relief. Lucas scanned the faces in front of him. I know this place hasn't been easy to work in. That ends now. We're fixing everything starting with how you're treated. He turned to Simon. You've been carrying more than your share of the workload. That's changing. You're getting a raise effective immediately. Simon's eyes widened. What? Lucas nodded. And better hours. You shouldn't be pulling double shifts just to keep this place running. Simon was too stunned to respond, just nodding quickly. Lucas turned toward Maria. You're not here to be pushed aside. If you ever feel like you're not being heard, my door is open. No more getting ignored when you bring up problems. Maria's grip on the register loosened slightly, the tension in her shoulders fading. Lucas addressed the whole team. I'm bringing in a new manager, someone who actually respects the people working here. In the meantime, I'll be here making sure things run the way they should. For the first time since he walked through the doors, the employees didn't look exhausted. They looked hopeful. Lucas took a deep breath, scanning the restaurant one last time. This wasn't just about fixing one location, it was about making sure this never happened again. And he would make sure of it. Lucas stayed at the restaurant for the rest of the day, working side by side with the employees. Without Greg looming over them, the atmosphere shifted. The tension that had hung in the air like a storm cloud slowly lifted. Orders still piled up, and there were still challenges, but the workers moved with a different energy, one that wasn't weighed down by fear. Simon adjusted quickly, though it was clear he wasn't used to working without the constant pressure of Greg's harsh criticisms. Maria, who had spent most of her time keeping her head down, started to speak up more, offering suggestions to make things run smoother. Lucas listened. By evening, Lucas pulled Simon aside near the storage area, away from the noise of the kitchen. You ever think about moving up here? Lucas asked. Simon looked confused. Moving up? You know this place better than most, Lucas said. You take on responsibilities that aren't yours because you care about the job. That's the kind of leadership we need. Simon hesitated, shifting his weight. I don't know if I'd be good at that. You're already doing the work, Lucas pointed out. The only difference is I'd make sure you get paid for it. Simon looked down, processing the offer. I never thought about it like that. Lucas nodded. Think it over, no pressure. But if you want it, the opportunity's here. Simon nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Lucas turned his attention to the rest of the store. He spent time talking to each employee, learning what had been ignored under Greg's management. Equipment had been failing for months with no repairs. Schedules were inconsistent. leaving some workers overwhelmed while others struggled to get enough hours. There was no system in place for recognizing hard work, just constant criticism. The next morning, Lucas arrived early with a maintenance team. The fryer was fixed, the faulty register was replaced, and a deep cleaning crew was brought in to restore order to the kitchen. Throughout the day, Lucas made calls, ensuring that the supply ordering process was tightened so poor quality shipments weren't accepted again. By midday, he sat down with Maria at one of the corner booths while the lunch rush settled. "You thinking about staying?" Lucas asked. Maria glanced around before answering. "Before yesterday, I was already looking for another job, but now it feels different, like we actually matter." "You do," Lucas said, "and I want to make sure you never feel otherwise again." She gave a small nod, her posture more relaxed than it had been when he first arrived. That evening, Lucas called a meeting before closing. The employees gathered near the counter, their expressions curious but no longer wary. "I want to be clear about something," Lucas said. "This isn't just about fixing what Greg broke. It's about making sure this place becomes what it was supposed to be from the start. A place where people are respected, where hard work is recognized, where customers come back because they know they're getting more than just food, they're getting service from people who actually care." He looked at the faces in front of him. "If any of you ever feel like something isn't right, you don't wait for it to get worse. You come to me. My office is open, but more importantly, I'll be here more often. No more managers hiding behind excuses. No more problems being ignored." There was a beat of silence before Simon spoke up. "So, you're not just walking away after this?" Lucas shook his head. "Not a chance." A few employees exchanged looks, the relief evident even without words. Lucas exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the past few days settle. There was still work to be done, but the hardest part, the part where people felt unheard, unseen, was over. As he locked up that night, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about fixing one store. It was about making sure no store under his name ever ran like this again. And he would make sure of it. Lucas returned to the restaurant the next morning, arriving just as the first shift was clocking in. The air inside felt different, lighter, but not yet settled. Employees moved with a cautious hope, as if waiting to see whether the change he'd promised would last. He stepped behind the counter, rolling up his sleeves. Simon was already at the grill, focused as he flipped patties. Maria was organizing the prep station, her movements smoother than before. There was still tension, but it no longer felt like the weight of something unbearable. Lucas scanned the kitchen, noting the adjustments made overnight. The repaired fryer hummed properly, the register no longer stalled, and the storage area was neatly arranged. Small changes, but ones that made a difference. Simon glanced up from the grill. "You're actually back," Lucas nodded. "Didn't say anything I didn't mean." Simon wiped his hands on his apron. "People keep saying it's weird not having Greg breathing down our necks. Feels like we're waiting for something to go wrong." Lucas leaned against the counter. "Nothing's going wrong, but I get why it feels that way." Simon hesitated, then lowered his voice slightly. "I heard some people saying Greg might try to come back, that maybe corporate will step in and undo everything." Lucas shook his head. "Greg's not coming back. And no one's undoing anything." Simon studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. Lucas stepped out onto the floor, observing the midday rhythm. The dining area was clean, customers were being served efficiently, and employees weren't rushing in a panic. There were still kinks to work out, but the foundation was solid. He approached Maria near the register. "How's it feel today?" She glanced around before answering. "Better. People aren't afraid to ask questions now." Lucas folded his arms. "That shouldn't have been an issue in the first place," Maria exhaled. "It was, though. If you asked the wrong thing, Greg would act like you were wasting his time. After a while, people just stopped asking." Lucas nodded. "That's changing. If something's not working, I want to know about it." Maria tapped a receipt against the counter. "Then you should know the shift schedule is still a mess. Some people are getting too many hours, others not enough. It's been like that for months." Lucas took the receipt from her, glancing at the names and times. "I'll fix it." Maria's expression was careful. "People are watching to see if you actually will." Lucas met her gaze. "They'll see soon enough." He spent the next hour reviewing the schedule in the back office, adjusting shifts to make them more balanced. By the time he returned to the floor, the dinner rush was beginning. The restaurant filled quickly and Lucas moved between stations, stepping in where needed. He took orders at the register, helped bag meals, and checked in with employees. At one point, Simon called him over to the grill. "The supply order came in, but we're short on buns again." Lucas frowned. "Did they mess up the order or did we underestimate what we needed?" Simon gestured toward the back. "I checked the invoice. They sent fewer than what was listed." Lucas glanced toward the storage area, then back at Simon. "Call the supplier, tell them we need the missing stock by tomorrow." Simon wiped his hands on his apron. "They don't usually fix mistakes that fast." Lucas nodded. "They will if I call them after you." Simon exhaled, then picked up the phone. The night continued without major problems, but Lucas stayed until close, helping with cleanup. Before leaving, he gathered the employees near the front counter. "You're not just workers here. You're the reason this place runs, and I want to make sure you're treated that way." Simon crossed his arms. "That sounds good, but people have heard promises before. What makes this different?" Lucas met his gaze. "Because I'm not leaving this time." Simon considered that for a moment, then nodded. Maria spoke up. "What's next?" Lucas glanced around the restaurant. "Next, we make sure no one falls back into old habits. That includes me." A murmur of agreement passed through the group. Lucas stepped toward the door. "I'll be back tomorrow." As he walked outside, he knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning.